David was a man who carried himself with calmness. He lived far from the noise of the city, on a wide piece of land that he had turned into a beautiful farm. From sunrise to sunset, he worked with steady hands, planting seeds, feeding animals, and taking care of the soil. To anyone who passed by, David looked like a simple farmer who loved the earth. People in town greeted him kindly, but no one ever asked much about his past. They only knew him as the man who kept to himself, always polite, and always busy with his land. The farm stretched over several acres. Rows of corn stood tall, their golden leaves dancing in the wind. Chickens clucked near the wooden coop, cows grazed lazily in the field, and a loyal dog kept watch by the front porch. The house was modest but strong, built with his own hands. He had chosen this quiet life years ago because he wanted peace. He wanted to live in a place where the sound of birds replaced the sound of sirens, and where the hardest challenge of the day was fixing a broken fence instead of facing danger. But what no one knew was that David's hands were not only trained to hold farming tools. Years ago, he had held weapons, studied maps, and carried out missions that most people could never imagine. He had been part of one of the most elite military units in the world, the Delta Force. He had traveled to deserts, jungles, and war-torn cities, where every decision meant life or death. He had trained his body to endure pain, his mind to stay sharp, and his heart to remain strong even in the darkest of times. Those years shaped him into a man who could handle anything. When he left the service, David did not tell anyone. He didn't brag or share stories. He simply disappeared into the countryside and started building a farm. For him, farming was more than work, it was healing. Planting seeds gave him hope, watching them grow gave him joy, and feeding animals reminded him that life could still be simple and good. Every day, he woke before dawn, did his chores, and enjoyed the quiet beauty of the land he owned. His neighbors sometimes wondered why he built strong fences and placed heavy locks on his barn. Some thought he was just overly protective of his tools and animals. Others thought he liked to keep things private. Nobody guessed that his habits came from years of discipline. He never left equipment scattered around. He always knew exactly where everything was. He moved with a kind of sharpness, like someone who had been trained for more than just farm work. Despite his quiet life, David had not forgotten the lessons of his past. Even as he watered his crops or repaired the roof, he remained aware of every sound around him. If a car drove by slowly, he noticed. If the wind carried the faint sound of footsteps, he could tell whether they were heavy or light. To him, paying attention was not paranoia, it was survival. The people in the town respected him but kept their distance. He was kind whenever he went to the market, always ready to help if someone needed a hand. Yet, he rarely joined social gatherings, and he never invited anyone to his farm. This gave him a bit of mystery. Some children imagined he was just a lonely man. Some grown-ups whispered that he had once been through something difficult, which explained why he liked being alone. None of them were wrong, but none of them knew the truth either. David himself was content. When he sat on the porch in the evening, with the orange sun dipping low and the air filled with the smell of fresh soil, he felt at peace. He didn't need attention. He didn't need recognition. What mattered to him was freedom to live his life without orders, without war, without fear. Still, there were moments when memories came back. Sometimes, the sound of thunder reminded him of helicopters. Sometimes, the cracking of wood reminded him of gunfire. But instead of letting those memories haunt him, he would walk into his fields, place his hands in the soil, and remind himself that he was home. He was no longer in danger. He was no longer fighting battles. His new battle was to grow food, to raise animals, and to live in peace. But the world around him was not always as peaceful as his farm. In the town, a group of reckless men had been causing problems. They stole from shops, threatened weaker people, and acted as if the law could not touch them. They had no respect for hard work. They believed that taking from others was easier than building something of their own. And soon, their eyes turned toward David's farm. From a distance, it looked like easy prey. To them, he was just a quiet farmer who probably had valuable tools, maybe some cash hidden in the house, and plenty of animals they could take. They had no idea who David really was. They saw him as soft, isolated, and harmless. Their arrogance made them believe raiding his farm would be quick and simple. But David's instincts told him something was wrong. A week before anything happened, he noticed small signs. A broken fence that did not break on its own. Footprints near his barn that didn't belong to him. A cigarette butt left near the edge of his field, though he never smoked. To someone else, these details might mean nothing. To David, they were clear warnings. He did not panic. Instead, he prepared quietly. He checked his tools and equipment, making sure nothing could be easily taken. He adjusted the locks on his barn and secured the doors of his house. More importantly, he walked the land carefully at night, memorizing every shadow, every sound. He wanted to be sure that when trouble came, he would know exactly how to handle it. Even his animals seemed to sense his alertness. His dog barked more often at night, standing guard near the porch. The cows grew restless whenever strangers passed too close to the fence. Nature itself seemed to warn him. David never looked for fights, but he also never ran from them. Deep inside, the soldier in him was still alive. He had chosen peace, but he knew that if anyone tried to destroy it, he would be ready. The farm was his home, his sanctuary, and his life. No one would take that from him. And so, as the sun rose each morning, David carried on like nothing was wrong. He planted, watered, and harvested. He fixed broken tools and fed the chickens. But inside, he was prepared. He knew the day would come when the men would test him. They would think they were raiding a farmer. They would think they had found an easy target. What they didn't know was that beneath the calm face of the farmer was the heart of a Delta Force commander. A man who had faced dangers greater than anything they could imagine. A man who had survived wars and missions that trained him to be ready for anything. David was no ordinary farmer. And soon, the group of men would learn that the quiet land they thought was easy to steal from belonged to someone they should never have underestimated. The trouble in town had been growing for months. At first, it started small tools disappearing from a shop, a few hens stolen from someone's yard, or fences cut near grazing fields. People whispered about a group of men who had no jobs, no discipline, and no respect for anyone's property. They moved around in a pack, laughing loudly, picking fights, and making others feel unsafe. The townsfolk had reported them many times, but the men were clever. They never left clear evidence, and they always stuck together. Whenever someone accused them, they denied it with mocking smiles. David, living on the edge of town, did not get involved in gossip. He believed in minding his own work and letting others handle their own problems. Still, he observed. He saw the way people looked nervous when these men walked into the market. He noticed how conversations went quiet until they left. David didn't fear them, but he understood danger when he saw it. These were not men who valued peace. They thrived on intimidation. One evening, the group sat in a rundown garage at the edge of town. They drank, smoked, and bragged about their small thefts. But their attention soon shifted to something bigger: David's farm. "He's got land, animals, and tools," one of them said, leaning back on a broken chair. "And he lives all alone. Easy money." Another laughed. "That old farmer won't even fight back. He'll probably beg us not to hurt his chickens. We'll be out of there before anyone even knows." They all agreed. To them, raiding David's farm wasn't just about stealing, it was about proving they could do whatever they wanted. The quiet farmer seemed like the perfect target. No one in town would defend him. No one would even suspect them if they moved quickly. But what they didn't know was that David had already sensed something. The morning after their meeting, David walked his land as he always did. The sky was grey, the air cool, and the ground still damp with dew. As he reached the edge of his cornfield, his eyes caught a boot print in the mud. It wasn't his. It wasn't from any neighbor, either. The print was deep, heavy, and fresh. He bent down, studied it, and immediately recognized the careless step of someone untrained. His old instincts, sharpened in years of missions, stirred inside him. Later that afternoon, when he went to check his barn, he noticed something else. A padlock had scratch marks around it, as if someone had tried to force it open but failed. David said nothing. He did not call the sheriff, nor did he tell the neighbors. Instead, he quietly reinforced the lock and made mental notes. His mind was calm, but his body was ready. At night, he stayed awake longer than usual, sitting on his porch with his dog at his feet. The field stretched out in front of him, silent and calm under the moonlight. But David knew silence could be deceptive. The world had taught him that danger often came when everything looked most peaceful. Over the next few days, he prepared without drawing attention. He checked every door and window on his farmhouse, making sure they could be secured quickly. He placed his tools in specific spots, not just for farming but for defense if necessary. Even ordinary items like shovels, ropes, and buckets could be useful in the right hands. He had trained all his life to turn the simplest things into protection. He also studied the patterns of his animals. The cows would grow restless when strangers approached. The dog, loyal and sharp, could hear the faintest movement long before David did. Even the chickens made different sounds when disturbed. To most people, these changes meant nothing. To David, they were early warnings. Meanwhile, the group of men grew bolder. They spent their evenings talking about how easy the raid would be. One of them boasted he could tie up the farmer in minutes. Another claimed they should load the animals onto a stolen truck and sell them the same night. Their arrogance blinded them to reality. They had never faced anyone truly prepared, and they certainly had never faced a man like David. One of them, slightly more cautious than the rest, raised a concern. What if he's got a gun or something? Old farmers sometimes keep one around. The leader smirked. Then we take it from him. You've seen him, he's just a quiet man with dirty boots. He's no soldier. Stop worrying. The others laughed and nodded. Their decision was made. The raid would happen soon. Back at the farm, David felt the tension growing. He could not explain it, but he trusted his instincts. Years of being in dangerous places had taught him to sense when eyes were watching, when steps were near, and when the air itself seemed heavier. He didn't live in fear, but he never ignored the signs. That evening, he took a slow walk along the fence line. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. He thought about how different this life was from his past. In the old days, he would have been in a distant country, preparing for a mission with his unit. Now, he was walking his own land, protecting crops and animals. Yet, the feeling inside him was the same, the calm before something big. He remembered the promise he had made to himself when he left the service, never to use violence unless absolutely necessary. He had chosen peace, and he wanted to keep it. But he also knew peace sometimes had to be defended. When he returned to the porch, his dog lifted its head and gave a low growl. David's eyes scanned the horizon. In the distance, he thought he saw a shadow moving near the edge of his land, but it disappeared quickly. He did not chase after it. Instead, he stood quietly, letting the night grow darker, his mind sharpening like a blade. Inside his farmhouse, he checked the locks one last time before going to bed. He placed a lantern on the table, a rope by the door, and his walking stick within reach. He didn't look nervous, he looked prepared. As he lay down, his thoughts drifted to the men who were planning to raid him. He didn't know their faces, but he knew their type. He had met men like them before, reckless, overconfident, and blind to their own weakness. He almost felt sorry for them. Almost. What they saw as an easy target was, in truth, the most dangerous mistake they could make. David wasn't just a farmer. He was a man who had led soldiers into battle, who had survived situations where failure was not an option. He didn't seek conflict, but he didn't fear it either. The group of men thought they were planning a raid. They thought they were walking into a simple farm. But in reality, they were walking into the home of a Delta Force commander, a man who had seen more than they could ever imagine. And soon, the night would come when their plan turned into their biggest regret. The night chosen for the raid arrived quietly. The air was cool, the sky was moonless, and a heavy stillness wrapped around the countryside. For most people, it was just another peaceful night. But for David, it was the night his instincts had been warning him about. He woke before midnight, his senses sharp. His dog gave a soft growl, confirming what David already felt: someone was coming. Far down the dirt road, a group of men moved in the shadows. They weren't soldiers, they weren't disciplined. They laughed quietly, pushed one another, and whispered plans with the careless confidence of people who thought they could not fail. There were 6 of them in total. They wore dark jackets and boots, carrying bats, crowbars, and a couple of stolen rifles. To them, this was just another adventure, a way to get money and prove their power. "Keep it quiet," the leader muttered, though his own voice carried too far. "We'll be done in an hour. Take what you can, scare the old farmer if he wakes up, and then we're gone." The others nodded, grinning. To them, David was only an old farmer with animals. They didn't know they were about to step into the wrong kind of battlefield. David sat calmly on his porch as the dog's ears twitched, listening to the distant sounds. He didn't panic. His face was steady, his breathing slow. He had faced nights darker than this one, in lands far more dangerous. He knew exactly how to handle men like these. Still, he waited. Waiting was a skill he had mastered long ago. The first sign of the raid came when the men reached the fence. One of them used a crowbar to snap the wooden posts, laughing when the boards cracked. The sound echoed across the field. To them, it was fun. To David, it was confirmation they had arrived. The animals stirred nervously. Chickens flapped in the coop, cows shifted in the pasture, and the dog gave another low growl. David placed a calming hand on the animal's head. "Easy," he whispered, his voice steady. He rose slowly, not rushing. Every movement was precise, controlled. He slipped into the shadows of his porch, his eyes tracking the intruders. Years of training had taught him how to see in the dark, how to use every sound and every movement to his advantage. The men entered the yard, kicking over buckets, pulling tools from their hooks, and laughing as they moved toward the barn. "See? Told you he was asleep," one of them whispered. "This is too easy." But David wasn't asleep. He was watching. He was listening. And he was already planning. Moving silently across the porch, he slipped around the side of the house. The men had no idea they were being observed. They thought the farm was empty, unguarded. Their confidence made them blind. The leader pointed toward the barn. "Check in there first. Farmers keep expensive gear locked up. Break the lock and grab what you can." One of the men ran forward, swinging his crowbar at the lock. The sound of metal hitting metal rang through the night. Sparks flew, but the lock held strong. He swung again, cursing under his breath. What he didn't realize was that David had reinforced it days ago, expecting exactly this moment. Inside the barn, the animals grew restless, kicking at the walls and making noise. The men laughed, thinking it was fear. They didn't know the real reason the animals sensed David's presence in the dark. From his position near the fence, David picked up a long wooden pole he had left leaning against the wall earlier. It looked like nothing more than a farming tool, but in his hands, it was balance, control, and precision. He gripped it lightly, testing the weight, his mind calm. The men continued their raid, splitting into pairs, 2 at the barn, 2 near the chicken coop, and 2 moving toward the farmhouse itself. They moved loudly, their boots crunching the dirt, their voices careless. David let them spread out. The more divided they were, the easier it would be. He slipped closer, his steps silent. Years of training made him invisible in the night. His movements blended with the darkness, his breathing barely a whisper. The first man to sense something was wrong was the one near the chicken coop. He bent down to unlatch the gate, but the chickens suddenly burst into loud clucking. Surprised, he looked around nervously. "What was that?" he whispered to his partner. "Relax," the other replied, kicking the coop. "They're just birds." But before the first man could calm himself, he felt a sudden pressure against the back of his leg. A quick sweep of the wooden pole knocked him off balance, sending him crashing into the dirt. His partner spun around, but all he saw was a shadow moving quickly out of sight. "What was that?" he shouted. "Shut up and get him up," the leader hissed from across the yard. "It's just the old farmer. Grab him if you see him." The men laughed again, but unease began to creep into their voices. David circled silently toward the barn. The two men there were still hammering at the lock, their backs turned. With calm precision, he stepped forward, using the pole again to knock one of the crowbars out of a man's hands. The weapon clattered to the ground. Startled, the man turned, only to see a firm figure disappear into the shadows. "He's here," the man shouted. "He's watching us." The leader swore under his breath. "Then catch him. He's just one man." But David was not just one man. He was discipline, strategy, and control. While the raiders stumbled around in confusion, he was guiding the entire scene. Every noise, every shadow, every step was under his watch. By now, the group realized this wasn't going to be as easy as they thought. The quiet farmer they expected to frighten was moving like a ghost around them, striking quickly and then vanishing before they could react. Their loud confidence began to crumble. Still, they pressed forward. Two of them approached the farmhouse door, ready to break it down. They raised their bats, but before they could swing, David's voice cut through the night. "Leave now," he said, calm but commanding. The words froze them in place. His voice carried strength that didn't sound like a farmer's. It was steady, powerful, and filled with authority. For a moment, none of the men moved. They looked at one another, uneasy. "Don't listen to him," the leader growled. "He's bluffing. Finish it." But deep down, even the leader felt a chill. Something about the voice, something about the way the shadows seemed alive around them, told him this wasn't going the way he planned. David stepped forward slightly, letting the dim light from the barn lanterns reveal just enough of his face. His expression was calm, his eyes sharp. The men stared, realizing this wasn't a simple farmer at all. There was a weight in his presence, the kind that only comes from someone who had faced danger many times before. The raid had begun, but already, the raiders were losing control. Their plan was falling apart. And they hadn't even seen the full measure of who David really was. The moment David stepped into the faint light, the men finally saw him clearly. He was not shaking with fear, nor was he hiding inside his house. He stood tall, shoulders square, his expression calm but firm. The dim glow showed the lines of a man who had lived a life of discipline, a man whose eyes carried quiet authority. For a second, the raiders hesitated. This was not what they had expected. The leader forced a laugh, trying to keep his men steady. "Look at him. Just an old farmer trying to scare us. Don't let him fool you." But the men were not so sure anymore. Something about David's presence made them uneasy. He didn't shout, didn't wave his arms, didn't act desperate. He simply stood there, as if he had all the time in the world. His stillness felt stronger than their noise. David took one slow step forward. "I will tell you one last time," he said, his voice steady. "Leave my land." One of the raiders, nervous but wanting to impress his friends, raised his bat and moved toward David. He swung with all his strength. But in less than a heartbeat, David shifted aside. His movements were so fast and precise that the man didn't even understand what happened until his bat was gone from his hands. David had twisted it away with a simple motion, leaving the man staring in shock. The other raiders froze. They had never seen anything like that. The leader snarled, "Don't just stand there, get him." Two men rushed at David at once. But David had faced far worse than this. He sidestepped the first, guiding him into the second, so they crashed into each other clumsily. Both fell to the dirt, their weapons slipping away. David did not chase them, did not strike them down, he simply stood tall, his eyes fixed on the rest. The men on the ground scrambled up, their arrogance fading. They were no longer laughing. They were beginning to realize the farmer was not just a farmer. "Who is he?" one whispered, rubbing his arm where he had fallen. The leader clenched his fists, trying to hold control. "He's just lucky. Don't lose your nerve." But inside, even the leader felt doubt. There was nothing lucky about what he had just seen. Those movements had been too sharp, too exact. They were the movements of someone trained, someone who had done this many times before. David's voice broke the silence. "You came here thinking I was weak. You thought you could take what you wanted. But you don't understand who you're dealing with." He stepped closer, and for the first time, they saw the strength in his stance. It wasn't the strength of a man who worked only with farming tools. It was the quiet strength of a soldier who had once carried the weight of missions that most men could not survive. His eyes, calm yet sharp, told stories without words. The men backed up slightly, their confidence cracking. One of them, shaking, whispered, "He moves like a soldier." David gave a small nod. "I was a soldier. More than that, I commanded soldiers. I've seen men tougher than you fall because they thought fear made others weak. But fear does not live here. Not tonight." The words hit them harder than any weapon. They finally understood this was not an ordinary man. This was someone who had trained, fought, and survived at a level they could never imagine. The leader tried one last time to rally his men. "Don't believe him. He's just bluffing. He can't take us all." But his words had no power now. The men had already seen too much. They had seen the speed, the control, and the authority in David's presence. None of them wanted to test him again. David slowly lowered the bat he had taken earlier and tossed it aside. "If you want to test me, do it now," he said. "But understand this, you will not win." Silence filled the yard. The men shifted uneasily, looking at one another. Their bravado had drained away, replaced by something unfamiliar, respect mixed with fear. Finally, one of them whispered, "We should go." Another nodded quickly. "Yet. This isn't worth it." But the leader, too stubborn to admit defeat, shouted, "Cowards! We can't just walk away empty-handed." David's eyes fixed on him. His calm voice carried more weight than the leader's anger. "You will walk away with your lives. That's more than you deserve tonight. Take it." The men hesitated only a moment longer before turning back toward the broken fence. One by one, they began to retreat. Even the leader, though he tried to hide it, followed slowly, his pride shattered. David didn't chase them. He didn't need to. He knew they had learned their lesson. His calm strength had done more than any fight could. As the men disappeared into the darkness, the farm grew quiet again. The animals settled, the night air softened, and the silence returned. David stood still for a while, his breathing even, his mind steady. He had defended his land without cruelty, without losing control. He had shown them who he was without needing to harm them. The dog returned to his side, tail wagging softly. David placed a hand on its head. "It's over," he whispered. But even as peace returned, he knew this night would not be forgotten, not by him, and not by those men. They had seen the truth behind the quiet farmer. They had seen the strength of a Delta Force commander. David walked back to his porch, the lantern casting a warm glow over the farmhouse. He sat down, his body relaxed, but his mind still sharp. He thought about the choices he had made leaving the battlefield, choosing a quiet life, building a home from the ground up. He had wanted peace, and he had earned it. But peace sometimes needed to be defended. And tonight, he had defended it. The men who thought they could take what was his had learned that true strength isn't about loud voices or numbers. True strength is quiet, calm, and unshakable. It lives in discipline, in patience, and in the courage to stand firm. For David, this night was not a victory. It was simply another chapter in a life of resilience. He had walked through wars and storms to arrive at this farm. He had chosen to plant seeds instead of carrying weapons. But when those seeds were threatened, he had shown he was still the man who could protect them. The raiders had seen him as weak. Now, they would never forget that behind the quiet farmer was a commander, a man who had lived through battles they could not imagine. And though the night was calm once again, David knew something important: word would spread. The story of the farmer who stood against a group of men would reach every corner of town. Some would be shocked, some would be proud, but all would understand one thing: David was not a man to be underestimated. The night of the raid ended quietly, but the story was far from over. David sat on his porch long after the men had gone, listening to the sounds of his farm returning to normal. The cows shifted calmly in their field, the chickens settled again in the coop, and the dog lay at his feet with its head resting peacefully. For David, this silence was the reward. He did not celebrate, nor did he feel anger. Instead, he felt a quiet satisfaction that peace had been protected without chaos. At dawn, the first rays of sunlight touched the fields, turning the dew into shining drops of silver. David rose as he always did, fed the animals, and walked across his land. The broken fence still leaned awkwardly where the men had forced their way in. He studied it for a moment, then gathered his tools. With steady hands, he repaired the fence board by board, working as though nothing unusual had happened the night before. To David, this was the lesson of life: storms come, but the land must still be tended. Trouble may arrive in the night, but the morning still requires work. That simple truth had carried him through battlefields, and now it guided him as a farmer. But while David returned to his normal rhythm, the men who had raided his farm could not forget what had happened. They carried the memory of the night like a heavy stone. Each of them had walked onto the farm believing they were strong, that they had power, and that the farmer was weak. Instead, they had walked away humbled, shaken, and unable to deny what they had seen. The leader tried to act as though nothing had happened. He told others they had simply decided not to take anything, but his men knew better. They had seen the way David moved, the way he spoke, and the way he stood with unshakable confidence. They knew they had faced someone unlike anyone they had ever met. One of the younger men whispered to a friend later that week, "He wasn't a farmer. He was something else. The way he moved, it was like he knew everything we were going to do before we did it." Word began to spread quietly around town. At first, it was just rumors. People heard whispers that the farmer on the edge of town had stood alone against a group of intruders. Some said he fought them off with nothing but his hands. Others said he had scared them away without lifting a finger. The story grew with each retelling, but the heart of it was true: David had not been the helpless man they thought he was. A few days later, the sheriff drove up to David's farm. The man was middle-aged, steady, and respected in town. He had heard enough whispers to come see for himself. Stepping out of his car, he tipped his hat. "Morning, David," he said. "Morning, Sheriff," David replied, calmly setting down the bucket of feed he was carrying. The sheriff looked around at the repaired fence, the animals grazing peacefully, and then back at David. "Heard some talk in town. Folks saying a group of men tried to cause trouble here. Is that true?" David met his eyes, his expression steady. "They came. They left." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "That's all. That's all that needs to be said," David replied. The sheriff studied him for a long moment. He had always wondered about David, the way he carried himself, the discipline in his movements, the calm in his voice. Now he suspected more than ever that the farmer's past held deeper stories. But he didn't press. Instead, he nodded slowly. "Well, if they bother you again, you let me know." "I will," David said, though they both knew he didn't need anyone's protection. The sheriff left, and David returned to his work. For him, the matter was closed. He had no interest in boasting or sharing details. His life was not about proving himself to others, it was about living with peace and purpose. But in town, the story continued to grow. People admired David even more now. Neighbors who had once only waved politely at the market began to greet him with warmth and respect. Some stopped by his farm to offer help repairing fences or bringing supplies. They didn't ask questions about his past, but their eyes carried a quiet recognition that they were living near someone extraordinary. One evening, as David walked through the fields, he thought about the men who had raided him. He wondered what they had learned. Had they understood the mistake of underestimating others? Had they realized that loudness and numbers do not equal strength? He hoped so. Because for him, strength had never been about force. It had always been about discipline, control, and knowing when to act. The weeks passed, and no one dared return to his farm. The men who had once bragged loudly in the town's garage were now quieter, their arrogance gone. They never spoke openly about the night, but their silence spoke louder than words. They avoided the edge of town where the farm stood, and whenever David's name was mentioned, they lowered their eyes. David, however, carried on as always. He rose with the sun, cared for his animals, planted his crops, and watched the seasons change. To him, that was victory, the chance to live quietly, to find joy in small things, to protect the land he loved. Yet, deep inside, he knew one truth: he would always be ready. His past as a Delta Force commander was not something he could erase. It lived in his discipline, in his awareness, in the way he saw the world. But instead of letting it weigh him down, he had turned it into strength for a new life. One afternoon, a neighbor's child asked him innocently, "Mr. David, are you really a soldier?" David smiled softly, kneeling to meet the boy's eyes. "I was once," he said. "But now, I'm a farmer." The boy tilted his head. "But you're still strong." David chuckled gently. "Strength isn't about fighting. It's about knowing how to protect what matters. Remember that." The boy nodded, eyes wide, and ran back to his mother. David watched them go, the smile lingering on his face. That was the lesson he wanted to leave behind, not one of fear, but one of quiet strength. As the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky with colors of gold and red, David sat once more on his porch. The land stretched out before him, peaceful and alive. The night air carried the sound of crickets, the smell of earth, and the calm of safety. He thought of the journey that had brought him here, the battles he had fought, the sacrifices he had made, the lives he had protected. All of it had led to this farm, this peace, this life he had chosen. And though the world around him might change, one thing would remain the same: he would always stand firm. Whether as a soldier or as a farmer, David's strength lay not in what he fought against, but in what he protected. The men who had once seen him as weak had walked away with a lesson they would never forget. The town that once saw him as just a farmer now understood the depth of his strength. And David himself knew that the greatest victory of all was not in battle, but in the quiet life he had built, defended, and cherished. The farm stood as more than a piece of land, it was a symbol of resilience, discipline, and the kind of strength that does not shout but endures. And so, as night fell and the stars appeared above, David sat in peace, knowing that he had lived true to himself. He was a farmer now, but within him lived the heart of a commander. And that truth would never fade.